Hello and welcome. And in this section, I'm going to be talking about MYOB, Greentree, eDocs, and purchase orders. So I guess first of all, what is eDocs PO? And just put in brackets there, not to be confused with AP invoices and the matching to a PO. So this is outside of the AP invoice arena, so to speak, but obviously we will touch on it when we come to the walkthrough and the demonstration. So it's an ability to bring in an external PO document and match it against an AP invoice in the system. We can talk about some scenarios as to what that means and some examples of it when we go through the walkthrough. You do have the ability to create a system-based purchase order in Greentree from this scanned-in document. You can also record the PO, so if it is what we're calling like a manual PO or external PO, you can record this in the system to therefore avoid AP invoices being matched again and again and again. So this is auditors like this, and let's face it, it makes sense. When the external PO comes into the system, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a supplier. Again, while that might sound a little bit odd, we'll discuss it in the demo as to how and why this comes about, and therefore how it could be used. Okay, so now a walkthrough of eDocs purchase orders and what it actually does, the concept, and what you can do with these purchase orders. So I'll start from the workflow desk, and I won't go through that bit about importing the purchase order, as we've covered that in other areas, but it's the same concept in terms of the purchase order that can either come in via an email or from a network drive. So here's one I've prepared earlier. So the concept being here that a purchase order has been written up, created at this stage outside of Greentree. So this is a document. It could even be a scrap of paper that somebody has written a request almost, or a purchase order, whatever terminology you want to use, on the basis of they've taken that somewhere to use as a document to order something, some goods or services. So here's the document. Again, it's fairly generic for this example. So again, similar concepts in terms of the eDocs screen looks the same. I can tie or assign a supplier to this purchase order at this time or not, as the case may be, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a second. Generally, of course, you'd want to put as many details as you can. So being this is a document or a purchase order at this point that is outside of Greentree, I can put a purchase order reference. So in this straightforward example, it's just PO number 100, the PO date. Again, this doesn't need to be assigned at this point, but I'm just going to put this in. Again, you don't have to assign a supplier, but I'm just going to put it to that supplier. So at this point, because I brought in this supplier, along with those other eDocs concepts that we've talked about, I've got a recently used, a favorites and inventory, because that's what I've assigned to the supplier by way of the type. You'll need to see the setup that goes into that in a bit more detail. But I don't have to do anything at this point, and I can put a value in as well if I want to. So let's just say, for argument's sake, I've bought some of those, for example. Now you'll see that these values are here. I can put a value in. This one would be that, for example. I don't have to match these at this point in time, but I can do. It depends on what your process and how you're going to bring these documents in and how you want to treat them. And although I might be sounding a bit vague, you'll see what this means in a second. So at this point, I can have several options. I can process it up here. What this means is I can send this document through an approval process using Greentree's alerts and approvals mechanism. I can assign it manually if I wanted to. So I can just assign it to someone send it to them and it'll appear on their workflow desk. Or if I wanted to, I could create a system-based PO. So even though this document request, you could even usually use the words requisition has come in, I could still create a system-based purchase order if that was part of my process. So at this point, maybe kind of clear, well, what's the benefit of this? What am I going to do? The document comes in, so it gives you a document that you can potentially then match against and record when the invoice comes in. I'll just go on to the next stage so you'll see the second part of the process. An invoice then comes in, quoting that PO. That may or may not be a system-based PO. It may still be that manual document that's come in. This is an AP invoice. Just going to put an invoice number in just so I can move through the process there. I'm going to call up the supplier. Now, given when you see the accounts payable eDocs video, this could have been scraped and these details could have come in. What you'll see, or what you'll notice here, is I've got this eDoc PO tab. So these are my purchase orders that have come in as eDocs. So here what you'll see is any purchase orders that I've just gone through the process of which I went through. So I've got another purchase order sitting there. The thing is that when I then click on that, you see that document there. Again, this saves a whole paper flow of going through the system to say, where's that document, and tying everything together and having huge amounts of paperwork. I just click on that one, you'll see there's another PO that's been brought in there. I can then use those POs, be them outside the system, to match against, which therefore stores that PO reference and saves them being matched to again. Again, the challenge always with what you might call manual POs or documents that do form a basis of purchase ordering or an instruction or an approval to create a purchase order, you don't want them to use that same number over and over and over again. Okay, one of my opening lines, or opening sentences I should say, was when I brought this PO in, was that you don't have to assign a supplier at this stage. So an example here might be someone that's out on site, a construction site or a services, and they have an instruction to go and buy some further materials from a hardware shop, be it a Bunnings, a Mitre 10, or whatever the local one is. Be it that the local one or the nearest one to the site might be unknown, how do they know who the supplier is? They don't. So it might not be until the invoice arrives that the supplier is actually known, but they want to record this purchase order. So when they send this purchase order in, however that process goes, they may not know the supplier. So how this came about, part of the setup here on the eDocs PO is I'm allowed to match against documents with no supplier. So in other words, when the invoice arrives, it quotes the purchase order number, as we've seen. It'll appear in that list. And I'm allowed to match the documents with different suppliers. So again, the concept was the PO arrives, the supplier is unknown, they've quoted that number. I don't want to have to backtrack my process to then undo it. So what I mean by that is I'll take out the supplier. Yeah, so that supplier is there. Come into this invoice. You'll see there that it still quotes PO 100 and the date and the amount, but there's no supplier assigned to that. So I can match against this PO if I need to. So again, that was part of the functionality or part of the request to how this came about, was that at the time they may not know who the supplier is, but clearly when the invoice arrives, they need to match against said supplier. So just a bit of background. I don't want to go into too much detail because that's covered separately. But in these supplier types on the eDoc PO, so of course, not every supplier has to work this way. So you could have certain groups of suppliers where this functionality assigns to. So there's more covered in this when we talk about supplier types and how these work, but these sit against the supplier. So it's kind of not an all or one scenario that this has to work through. Sorry, lots of clicking there. So a brief recap. A purchase order, manual purchase order, a request arrives outside the system. I can create a system-based PO if I want to on the back of this. I can assign it to a person. I can push it through my alerts and approvals module. I can assign it to a supplier or not. I can assign the value or not. The key thing would be that you want to assign it as a purchase order number. So a manual purchase order book you might have. Someone out on site who's doing requests on the fly. When the invoice arrives, just going to call up a supplier here. Depending on the supplier, whether they're actually using this function, there's an eDoc PO tab, which I can then pick off. I can still see them. So again, I haven't got the paper trail. It might be multiples. I can assign them against multiple POs as well, if I want to. Creating that trail all online, no printing off of documents, and things can be approved. Okay, I hope that's given you a good overview and walkthrough of eDocs purchase orders. Thanks for your time.